Have you ever had someone walk into your home uninvited, rummage through your personal belongings, and then try to justify it with a clipboard and fake authority? That's exactly what happened when my HOA president decided she had the right to inspect my bedroom without permission. The violation was shocking enough, but what she didn't know about me would turn her power trip into a criminal case. Hi, I'm Aaron Kelly, and I'm the one sharing this story with you today. The sound of footsteps creaking across the ceiling above my bedroom last Tuesday afternoon sent ice through my veins. I lived alone in this house for 8 years, and those weren't my footsteps. My first instinct was to grab my phone and start recording as I moved silently toward the stairs, every nerve on high alert. What I discovered when I reached my bedroom doorway would have been unbelievable if I hadn't captured it on video. There stood Megan White, our Willowbrook HOA president, casually rifling through my closet with her ever-present clipboard, completely absorbed in whatever inspection she thought she was conducting. She didn't even notice me standing there watching her violate every boundary of privacy and legality. My voice cut through the silence sharper than I intended. "What exactly are you doing in my house?" Megan spun around, and what struck me most wasn't surprise or shame on her face, but pure arrogance. She actually straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and looked at me like I was the one who'd done something inappropriate. "Oh, Aaron, I'm conducting an emergency inspection," she said matter-of-factly, as if this explained everything. "The HOA has concerns about property maintenance standards in this neighborhood, and we need to verify compliance." She turned back to my closet and made another note on her clipboard while standing in my private bedroom. The audacity of it made my jaw clench. But years of professional training had taught me that emotional reactions cloud judgment, so I kept my voice level and firm. "You've broken into my home. Leave immediately before I call the police." I expected some recognition of the severity of what she'd done, but instead, Megan actually laughed. She waved her clipboard at me like it was some kind of magical warrant that granted her unlimited access. "This isn't breaking in, Aaron. You really should read your HOA bylaws more carefully. Article 7, Section 3 clearly states that we have the right to conduct emergency inspections when property concerns arise." She turned back to my closet, pulled out her phone, and started photographing what she apparently considered violations. The camera flash illuminated her face each time, and I realized she was creating evidence of her own crime without even understanding it. That detail would become more important than she could possibly imagine in the coming weeks. "Get out, now." My voice dropped to the temperature I usually reserved for attorneys who tried my patience in court. Something in my tone finally registered because Megan stopped photographing and moved toward my bedroom door, though she made sure her exit was theatrical and unhurried. She paused at my front door to deliver what she clearly thought was a devastating parting shot. "You'll be hearing from the HOA board about your lack of cooperation, Aaron. And those code violations I documented today? Expect significant fines." She tapped her manicured nails against the clipboard with each word, emphasizing what she believed was her power over me. The morning sunlight caught the small HOA president pin on her blazer, a piece of metal she wore like law enforcement would wear a badge. I said nothing, just closed the door behind her and immediately downloaded the security footage from my phone to 3 separate locations. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang with the kind of insistence that suggested whoever was pressing it had no intention of leaving. Through the peephole, I saw Megan flanked by 2 other board members, their faces arranged in expressions of bureaucratic determination. I opened the door but remained firmly planted in the doorway, making it clear they wouldn't be entering. "Mr. Kelly," Megan began, her voice dripping with false formality that grated on my nerves. "Upon further review of our bylaws, I need to clarify the scope of our inspection rights." She produced a document and held it up like she was presenting sacred text. "Emergency inspections are permitted when property integrity threatens neighborhood values. Your unmade bed and disorganized closet constitute such threats to our community standards." The 2 board members behind her nodded in synchronized agreement that was clearly rehearsed. One of them, a thin, nervous-looking man named Roger, was actually taking notes while Megan spoke as if documenting this confrontation for official records. Furthermore, Megan continued, warming to her subject. "Your refusal to cooperate has been documented and noted. The HOA takes a very dim view of residents who obstruct our efforts to maintain community standards." She smiled then. The kind of predatory smile that made my instincts flare. Of course, we could overlook today's unfortunate misunderstanding if you'd simply allow us to complete our inspection properly. We're reasonable people, Aaron. We just need your cooperation. The implicit threat hung in the air between us, but she'd badly miscalculated who she was dealing with. No, the single word hung between us like a steel wall. Megan's confident smile faltered slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm sorry?" she said, as if she'd never actually heard someone refuse her authority before. "No inspection, no entry, no exceptions," I repeated, keeping my voice level and professional despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Megan's face flushed red as her carefully constructed authority began to crack around the edges. She opened her mouth to argue, but I simply stepped back and closed the door. Through the wood, I heard her sharp intake of breath and Roger's nervous question about what they should do next. She didn't know it yet, but she'd already lost this battle the moment she'd stepped into my house uninvited. The violation notice arrived at 7 o'clock the next morning, hand-delivered by Megan herself. She stood on my doorstep in a crisp power suit, clearly dressed for what she considered war. $500 fine for non-compliance with HOA inspection requirements, she announced, thrusting the official-looking paper at me. Additionally, your property has been flagged for monthly reviews until you demonstrate appropriate cooperation with community standards. The document was impressive in its bureaucratic nonsense, citing bylaws that had been twisted and interpreted beyond any reasonable recognition. Megan wasn't finished with her pronouncements, though. By noon that same day, photos of my home's interior had appeared in the HOA's private online group, accompanied by her inflammatory commentary. Concerned about declining standards in our community, her post read, "Some residents think they're above the rules that the rest of us follow." The images she'd taken during her illegal entry were now weapons in her public campaign against me. My unmade bed from Tuesday morning became photographic evidence of deteriorating household maintenance. My home office, with its law books and case files stacked on my desk, was labeled as excessive clutter affecting property values. The responses from other residents in the comment section ranged from confused questions to enthusiastic support of Megan's crusade. Several people I'd never even spoken to were suddenly experts on my threat to neighborhood integrity. The digital pile-on was building momentum, and Megan was clearly orchestrating every bit of it. Tom Bradley, my next-door neighbor for the past 8 years, knocked on my door that evening looking uncomfortable. "Aaron, what's going on? Megan's telling everyone you're some kind of problem resident. She's even suggesting you might be running an illegal business from home without HOA approval. Maybe something shady given how private you keep things." His face showed genuine concern mixed with the kind of curiosity that comes from not knowing what to believe. "Tom, I've lived here 8 years, I said quietly, meeting his eyes directly. "Have I ever been a problem neighbor to you?" He shook his head slowly, processing the question. "That's exactly what doesn't make sense about all this. You're literally the quietest guy on the entire street. You keep your lawn perfect, never make noise, never cause issues. This whole thing feels wrong." That night, I sat down and reviewed my security footage with methodical care. The cameras had captured something very interesting that I'd only half noticed in the moment. Megan had entered my home using an old access code on my smart lock, one that I'd completely forgotten to delete after the previous owner had given it to the HOA for emergency maintenance access years ago. The footage showed she'd been inside my house for a full 12 minutes before I discovered her upstairs. 12 minutes of rifling through my personal belongings, photographing my private spaces, and violating every reasonable expectation of privacy that any person should have in their own home. The footage was crystal clear, perfectly time-stamped, and absolutely damning. I saved multiple copies to different secure locations, knowing this evidence would soon become critically important. I spent the next 48 hours building my case with the kind of methodical precision I'd learned over years on the bench. The security footage revealed far more than just Megan's illegal entry into my house. It showed a disturbing pattern of behavior. By cross-referencing timestamps with my neighbor's doorbell cameras, which several of them shared with me once I started asking questions, I discovered that Megan had attempted similar unauthorized inspections at 5 other houses in our subdivision over the past month alone. Tom Bradley proved particularly helpful when he shared his own unsettling experience. She showed up one afternoon when my wife was home alone and insisted on checking our attic for potential fire hazards. My wife felt too intimidated to refuse her, but it made her really uncomfortable having Megan up there alone, going through our stuff. My visit to the police station proved enlightening in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Officer Brian Cooper took my report with professional interest that visibly sharpened when I showed him the security footage on my phone. Breaking and entering is a felony, Mr. Kelly, regardless of what any HOA bylaws claim to authorize, he said firmly, making notes in his report. No homeowner association anywhere has the legal right to enter private property without explicit consent or a valid court order. That's fundamental law. He made copies of everything I'd brought, assigned an official case number to my complaint, and promised to follow up with a formal investigation. Then he added something quietly that caught my attention. We've actually had informal complaints about Mrs. White before from other residents. Nothing this concrete or well documented, though. This changes things significantly. The real breakthrough came from a completely unexpected source later that evening. Janet Mills, the HOA's own retained attorney, called my home number. Mr. Kelly, I'm reaching out to you unofficially and somewhat against my better judgment, she began carefully. Megan White contacted me earlier today about pursuing legal action against you for what she's calling obstruction and defamation. I have serious concerns about her interpretation of our bylaws and her understanding of her authority. Her voice carried the weight of someone watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. She seems to genuinely believe she has some kind of quasi-governmental authority over residents. She doesn't. That's not how any of this works legally. Janet's voice dropped lower. I've advised her in the strongest possible terms to cease all inspection activities immediately. She refused to listen to me and actually questioned my competence as an attorney. I thanked Janet for her candor and hung up, carefully adding her statement to my growing file of evidence. The previous homeowner's records, which I'd kept in storage, yielded one final critical piece of documentation. The smart lock access code had been provided specifically for emergency maintenance purposes only, with explicit written requirements for 24-hour advance notice, except in cases of immediate safety hazards like gas leaks or fire. Megan had violated not just criminal law and basic civil rights, but her own HOA's clearly written policies. Every single move she'd made had generated evidence against her, and she'd been too blinded by her perceived authority to realize it. The trap she'd built was perfect, and she'd walked right into the center of it. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Friday night, and Megan had clearly spent the week mobilizing all her forces for what she expected to be my public humiliation. The community center was absolutely packed with residents who'd received alarming emails about security concerns and non-compliant homeowners supposedly threatening everyone's property values. I entered quietly to find Megan already at the podium with a laser pointer in hand, presenting an elaborate slideshow titled Protecting Our Community Standards. My face appeared prominently on slide 3, alongside all those photos of my home's interior that she'd obtained illegally. As you can clearly see, Megan announced to the room of nearly 200 residents, her voice carrying authority and righteousness. Some individuals in our community believe they're exempt from the rules the rest of us follow every single day. Mr. Kelly refused what was simply a routine safety inspection, verbally threatened board members who were just trying to do their jobs, and has been flagged by multiple concerned neighbors as a potential problem. The lies flowed from her mouth so smoothly that I realized she'd probably convinced herself they were true. Several planted board supporters scattered throughout the room nodded vigorously at her words, creating a carefully constructed illusion of community consensus. I'm proposing tonight a special assessment, Megan continued, clicking to her next slide. A $5,000 fine for any resident who obstructs HOA operations, plus mandatory monthly inspections until full compliance is achieved and maintained. The proposed fine amount drew gasps from several attendees, but Megan pressed forward confidently. When she finally called for questions from the floor, I stood slowly from my seat in the middle section. The room's attention shifted like a physical tide, and I could feel 200 pairs of eyes turning toward me. "Mrs. White, I have a question about legal authority," I began, my voice carrying the same measured tone I used when questioning witnesses in my courtroom. "Could you please explain which specific statute or law gives you the right to enter private homes without consent, warrant, or emergency circumstances?" Megan's smile was patronizing and dismissive. "The bylaws are very clear about emergency inspections, Mr. Kelly. Perhaps if you'd bothered to attend more community meetings over the years, you'd understand how things work here." She started to turn back to her audience, literally waving her hand to dismiss me. This is exactly the kind of entitled hostility we're addressing tonight. "I have one more question," I continued, pulling out my phone and holding it up so the screen was visible. "Mrs. White, is this you entering my home last Tuesday at 12:07 in the afternoon?" I pressed play on the security footage. Even on my small phone screen, the video was perfectly clear. The audio picked up Megan's voice talking to herself about violations as she photographed my bedroom. Immediate murmurs rippled through the crowd like electricity. Megan's confident face went deathly pale, then flushed bright red within seconds. That was an authorized inspection under emergency protocols," she stammered, her voice climbing a full octave higher than her previous confident tone. "You're deliberately taking this out of context to make me look bad." But the damage was already done. People throughout the room were whispering to each other, questioning, doubting everything she'd said. The meeting she'd so carefully orchestrated to crush me had just become the stage for her own very public self-destruction. Saturday morning brought a certified letter that demonstrated Megan had learned absolutely nothing from Friday night's disaster. She'd escalated beyond any reasonable point, filing a formal HOA lawsuit seeking injunctive relief to force inspections of my property and collect $10,000 in accumulated fines she'd apparently been inventing. The paperwork was impressively official-looking, complete with Janet Mills' clearly reluctant signature as HOA legal counsel, but Megan had finally, catastrophically, overplayed her hand. It was time to reveal what she'd never bothered to discover about the quiet neighbor she'd targeted. I sat down at my home office desk and drafted my response on the official letterhead I rarely used outside of court. The words came easily because they were simply facts. "Dear Mrs. White and the Willowbrook HOA Board, I write in response to your letter dated Friday. As you have chosen to escalate this matter to formal legal proceedings, I must inform you of several critical facts. First, your emergency inspection of my home on Tuesday constitutes breaking and entering under State Statute 18-1504. Second, your publication of illegally obtained photographs constitutes invasion of privacy and violation of my civil rights. Third, your false statements at Thursday's public meeting constitute defamation per se, which carries specific legal consequences. Each word was carefully chosen, each citation precisely accurate, building methodically to the revelation that would shatter her entire perceived world of authority. I saved the final paragraph as the killing blow. As a sitting judge for the United States District Court, I have an obligation to report criminal activity to appropriate authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been notified of potential civil rights violations under color of authority. Additionally, I have filed criminal complaints with local law enforcement. Cease and desist all illegal activities immediately. The Honorable Aaron Kelly, U.S. District Judge. I included copies of my judicial appointment documentation, the complete criminal complaint I'd filed with police, and screenshots of every defamatory post she'd made in the HOA group. Within 1 hour of sending that letter via certified mail and email, my phone began exploding with calls and messages. Janet Mills was first, her voice actually shaking with what sounded like panic and relief mixed together. "Judge Kelly, I had absolutely no idea who you were. If I had known, I never would have." Megan acted completely without full board approval on most of this. "We're calling an emergency meeting immediately to address this situation." Tom Bradley knocked on my door within the hour, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something close to awe. "You're a federal judge?" Aaron, Megan's been telling everyone for weeks that you're unemployed, probably doing something shady from home to pay your bills. The irony isn't lost on me. The irony was indeed delicious. She'd manufactured an entire narrative about a suspicious, possibly criminal neighbor when she was the one systematically breaking laws. By evening, Megan's fellow board members were distancing themselves from her at light speed. Her phone calls weren't being returned, her emails were going unanswered, and the HOA's emergency session was hastily scheduled for Sunday morning. Based on the panicked emails flying around that I was being copied on, Megan White was about to discover exactly what happened when you broke into the wrong house and violated the wrong person's constitutional rights. The reckoning she'd never imagined possible was coming fast. Sunday's emergency HOA meeting was standing room only, and the energy in the room was completely different from Friday night. Word had spread through the entire subdivision like wildfire. Megan White had broken into a federal judge's home. The same community center that had hosted her power play just 2 days earlier now felt like a courtroom, and Megan was clearly the defendant. She sat at the board table completely isolated, her fellow board members having strategically positioned themselves as far from her as the table's dimensions allowed. Janet Mills stood at the podium, her face professionally neutral, but her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped her notes. We're here to address serious allegations regarding unauthorized entry into a homeowner's residence and subsequent actions taken by a board member. Janet began, her legal training evident in every carefully chosen word. The board has reviewed extensive security footage and documentation provided by Judge Kelly. The evidence is conclusive and deeply troubling. The murmurs that rippled through the crowd were different now, angry instead of confused, directed at Megan instead of at me. Megan stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is nothing but a witch hunt," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "I was protecting our property values. Someone has to maintain standards when residents refuse to cooperate with basic community rules." She looked around the room as if expecting support, but found only hostile stares and people actively avoiding her gaze. I stood from my seat in the third row, and the room fell into immediate, complete silence. "Mrs. White, let me be absolutely clear about what happened," I said, my voice carrying easily through the quiet space. "You entered my home using an emergency maintenance code without any notice or permission. You photographed my personal belongings and distributed those images publicly in violation of my privacy. You made demonstrably false statements about my character and occupation to damage my reputation. These aren't HOA violations or differences of interpretation. They're crimes under state and federal law." Each word landed with the weight of a gavel strike. Megan's face cycled rapidly through emotions. Anger, fear, defiance, and finally, something approaching panicked realization of how serious this had become. "You can't prove anything that would hold up in court," she said, but her voice had lost all its previous confidence. "I have authority under the bylaws. I was acting in my official capacity." But even as she spoke those words, the community center's main door opened, and Detective Sarah Johnson entered with 2 uniformed officers behind her. The room went deathly silent as Detective Johnson approached the board table directly. "Megan White, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, criminal trespass, harassment, and invasion of privacy." The metallic click of handcuffs closing around Megan's wrists echoed through the silent room with a finality that seemed to freeze time. Megan's protest dissolved into sputtering disbelief as the reality crashed over her. "You can't do this to me. I'm the HOA president. I was just doing my job, protecting this community." Her voice had become shrill and desperate. As the officers led her toward the door, she turned back to the stunned crowd one final time. "I did this for all of you, to protect our community and our property values." But the community had already turned away from her, literally and figuratively. Her perceived authority had evaporated the moment those handcuffs clicked shut. 6 weeks later, justice was formally and completely served. Megan White stood before a criminal court judge, not me, obviously, but a colleague who showed absolutely no sympathy for her community protection defense. The sentence was comprehensive. 2 years probation with strict conditions, 500 hours of community service specifically focused on privacy rights, education, a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board anywhere in the state, and mandatory counseling for what the judge termed authority dysfunction, the Willowbrook HOA settled my civil lawsuit with remarkable speed, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal and limit their liability exposure. Their insurance company insisted on a complete rewrite of the bylaws with crystal clear limitations on board authority, including absolute requirements for warrants before any property entry could occur. I still live in the same house where all this happened, still keep mostly to myself, still work from my home office handling federal cases. The new HOA board sends friendly newsletters and community updates, but nothing else ever. They've learned the boundaries of their authority, and they respect them completely. Property values in Willowbrook have actually increased significantly since the scandal became public, which Megan would probably find bitterly ironic. Apparently, homebuyers really appreciate knowing their HOA can't break down doors or invade their privacy on a whim. Sometimes I see former board members at the grocery store or the gas station. They nod politely and respectfully, but they keep walking, having learned the hard way that a little bit of power doesn't mean unlimited authority over other people's lives. And Megan White? She moved out of state last month to start over somewhere nobody knows her story. Her house sold quietly through a specialized broker who handles what they delicately call sensitive situations. The woman who'd been so obsessively concerned about maintaining neighborhood standards and protecting property values had become the cautionary tale told at every HOA conference and training session in the region. She's now the president who broke into the wrong house and discovered that justice doesn't recognize HOA badges or clipboards as legitimate authority. Her name has become shorthand in our community for what happens when power goes unchecked and someone forgets that other people have rights that supersede neighborhood bylaws. Privacy isn't just a personal preference or a nice idea. It's a fundamental constitutional right that's been recognized for centuries. And sometimes, apparently, it takes a federal judge standing in his bedroom in pajamas to remind people of that essential truth. What do you think about my situation? Have you ever dealt with an HOA or neighbor who thought they had more authority than they actually did? Leave a comment below and share your story, because I'd love to hear how others have handled these kinds of power-tripping situations in their own communities.